We will now commence our last and final part of our session on the Abeka Reading Program and the science of reading. If you've made it to this part, then you have certainly been informed of some preliminary understandings of what the science of reading is, about how its elements work together, about how the Abeka Reading Program, how it has all these elements that are purposefully put into it. And now we're really building on that idea of having students understand and know what they read. So we've already talked about 3 parts of the science of reading, and that is phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Now we're going to get into the 4th and 5th, vocabulary and comprehension. So let's start with vocabulary. And I know you kind of have it divided into 2 broad purposes.
So when we're talking about developing vocabulary, we first need our students to understand it. And with that, learning new words as they develop and expand their vocabulary, and then using them, that they're able to use them appropriately. We've said all along that there's so many of the things that we do in our reading program that are broad and that overlap. So we've already mentioned a number of ways that we're expanding their vocabulary. To be very specific, inside of our spelling and vocabulary section of our day, we would be developing this. In first grade, they don't have what we would designate as vocabulary words, but of the 420 spelling words that they practice, the teacher will be helping them to understand those words and give them informal definitions, if you will. And then in second grade, they begin to add in the vocabulary words that have a formal definition on their spelling lists. So in second grade, we have 549 spelling words and 54 vocabulary words. And in third grade, 562 spelling words and 118 vocabulary words. You can see that increase. The trajectory would imply that following grades will continue to expand in that. And I just gave us the first 3 to give that idea of what's happening. And when we look at a spelling list, the teacher will introduce the list by pronouncing the words, and then any words that are on the spelling list that need to be explained, she will. And also using them in a sentence so that the students are not only hearing the new words, getting the definitions, they're hearing how to use them in a good sentence, in what we would say a model sentence. In addition to that, there will be activities attached to each of these spelling lists to allow the children to practice using them appropriately, not only in some of the specific ways, like maybe they're alphabetizing them or something like that, but then they're also going to be writing sentences that will help them demonstrate that they understand. Of course, you can see here on this sample list from third grade, the vocabulary words there at that specific portion, and then over. The other thing to notice that we will always want to call attention to is when we're practicing a spelling list, there's usually some kind of a theme, if you will, but those themes are tied into some kind of a spelling rule or a specific phonics rule that they're applying. And that's something that the teacher is going to be emphasizing with the children, so that not only do they learn how to spell the words that are on the list, they will also be able to apply that rule to other words that they haven't seen. And that really does tie in as well to the vocabulary that they are developing and being able to use it as well, especially as they get into the upper grades, because we'll start to develop their suffixes, prefixes, and roots, which will help them understand, as far as vocabulary is concerned, words that they've never seen before. They can come up with a pretty close definition without having ever looked it up in a dictionary or had someone explain it to them.
I was in a public transportation Lyft a year or 2 ago, and the driver was telling me about a word that he had come up with, and it was chromicide. And I said, "Oh, killing time." And he said, "You are the only person that has ever figured that out." Flattering as those words may be, I'm sure that's not the case, because as soon as I said chromicide, a lot of you were thinking chromo, time, side, to kill. All right, we're killing time. And so that's just an example of when you have those essential word parts that we're trying to help our students understand, it opens the door to so many other words that they don't even have to have heard it before, but they can put together that meaning. And again, that emphasizes their understanding as they develop that vocabulary.
Then the second list that's on here has a theme to the list. It's not a specific phonics or spelling rule, but it is one that's really helpful for our students because all of these words on the list are words that we've borrowed from other languages. And again, those words may not follow the phonics rules because they're coming from another language. So practicing them on the spelling list is helpful, but it also allows the students to be exposed to them if they haven't heard them before to develop their vocabulary. Then as we continue on, going back again to readers. In fact, the first example I have is the I Can Read Well Book 1 from the Teacher's Edition in the kindergarten. This is the K-5 reader, but you'll see at the bottom, so this is the teacher material, down there in the blue, there are specific vocabulary words for the teacher to communicate to the students that will be developing their vocabulary. You'll also see on the other side of the page the example of the quests from the Quest for Nature that have on the table of contents 2 of the charts that are being highlighted in that text. And then as we look into the book a little bit on page 4, the words to watch for. Again, we've talked about that when we were discussing fluency, that those words help us to prepare our students with their comprehension by helping expand their vocabulary. Everything ties together. And then they get into their reading and they get to enjoy that. When we consider using new words, that can come in so many different applications. These particular exercises are coming from the spelling books and certainly are examples of using new words, some of the most basic examples. But knowing that starting in first grade, we could say in kindergarten, we're having the students write sentences and then building those into stories and paragraphs, that they're using these new words that they're learning all the time. In the lower elementary, when they are going to write a story about something, first the teacher will teach the content and write many of the key words up on the board that will help the children not only to be prepared for the content, but also to be prepared for the spelling of it, which is very helpful. It keeps things moving more efficiently while they're actually working on that project.
I think one thing to emphasize too, whether it's helping them with the spelling while they're writing, or even as we saw in the previous slide, introducing those words, anytime a child, as he's reading, if he comes across a word that he doesn't quite know how to read phonetically, or if he's writing and he doesn't quite know how to spell it, that breaks his train of thought. And a broken train of thought is going to make it far more difficult to comprehend the entire one. And in a few minutes, I know you're going to talk about the domain knowledge and the Matthew effect, but our purpose, I know. But I'll let you talk about what it is. But the whole purpose of it is to keep that fluency, for lack of a better term, in the writing, in the reading, that there are few disruptors. So that is a critical piece, is those preliminary words at the beginning of the readers, those written words spelled out before the student is going to write them, to help them focus on the content and not get tripped up on the pronunciation or the spelling or the meaning.
And as she speaks so eloquently as an English teacher, if you haven't guessed, we both are English teachers. and I already mentioned that writing is such a powerful opportunity to practice using this new vocabulary. The flow of thought, when we're first teaching the children how to write and to write fluently, they are not being asked to collect the information, the content. When they get a little bit older, then we expect them not only to collect the content, but also to do the writing of it. This example that I have for you comes from first grade, and it's one of the last projects that they do in first grade. It takes them 5 lessons. This is where they are applying more of the writing process, writing multiple drafts, and they would write their final copy inside kind of these decorative pages that come from the writing with phonics. That's why I have both of those listed there. They practice in their writing tablet, and then they'll put their final draft in the decorative pages that are going to be assembled, and it's a little booklet called Let's Write About Animals that they're using to practice what they've been learning, and of course also we use their vocabulary as they work through that. As we continue along that thought with our students, I've got examples of the pages coming up for you, and you get to see how decorative and pretty they are. The children just love that. But Cindy was giving away just a moment ago that I was going to talk about.
That was foreshadowing. I was just including, some complexity to the conversation.
So we were going to mention domain knowledge. The concept of domain knowledge, I'm borrowing from E.D. Hirsch, who was a researcher on education. He wrote about quite a few things. According to him, a reader needs to know about 90 to 95% of the words in a passage that they're reading in order to understand it. When they have that much already in their known vocabulary, then the other 5 or 10% can be kind of guessed or inferred correctly, in the same way that we kind of pick up oral language in early childhood, and that sustains the vocabulary growth throughout our lives. So if we're having a conversation and there's one word in the conversation that you don't recognize, in the context, because you know all of the other elements within that conversation, you're going to be able to most likely put together what it is. Now, what that leads to is what Keith Stanovich, who's a reading researcher, refers to as the Matthew effect. Because what he's saying is, based off of the parable from Matthew 25, that those talents were passed out to a number of different servants. One servant got 5, he worked really hard, and he doubled that to 10. Another servant got 2 and doubled it to 4. And then one servant got 1 and hid it and didn't get any doubling. And then when the master came back, he said, well, at least you could have done was put it out to interest. Now, you can't over apply this metaphor, if you will, but the concept that he's using it to convey is that if you have much, like the servant who had 5 and doubled it to 10, the servant who had 1 and didn't do anything with it had his 1 talent taken away and given to the servant who at that point had 10, which meant from the one who had the most, he gained even more. That's the concept. That's the point that Keith Stanovich was trying to make by calling this the Matthew effect. So a child who has a good vocabulary will continue to build a better and better vocabulary, and a child who has a limited vocabulary will always struggle and face limitations because there's so little that they do know that they can't by themselves add on new knowledge. And that really highlights for us as teachers how important it is for us to help the children as young as we can to develop their vocabulary as much as we can.
And that's why parents of young children, especially, that interaction, that conversation, knowledge begets knowledge, comprehension begets comprehension. The more a student understands, the more he is able to understand. That's why for some of you that if this session was the first time you heard some of those terms like morphemes and graphemes and logographs, you were at least able to understand the words around them to pick up that meaning quickly. But if you dive into terminology, most of us have gone into maybe a doctor's office or we've worked in an area of zoology, and there's all these terms that we don't understand. When I was taking my master's in English, there was all these terms that especially more progressive English users tend to use, and it's new to you. You may have perfect phonics and wonderful comprehension, but if you don't know that area, you're still struggling to soak in everything. So giving students a wide understanding of many areas of life. I love the language development visuals that are used, especially in the 2s and 3s and K4, is just giving them the opportunity to then grow exponentially in their understanding of that. And that brings us to that 5th and final portion of the science of reading, which is comprehension, which is the synthesis of all these elements, taking them together and being able to understand the meaning of what is being written. And that's what you have here on this slide. The goal of reading is to understand what is read. And that's why, especially, some of you may be secondary teachers as well. Most of your students already know how to read, and you're trying to help them understand the deeper layers of meaning. Because what has always touched my heart is when my students come into my class and they don't understand that literature passage or story that they had read, I always wonder what is going on when you're reading scripture. And so certainly there is that advantage too. The more I studied literature, even as an adult, my understanding of scripture just from that first reading increased. Of course, we have the Holy Spirit to give us that enlightenment, but there is much that we can do to help our students. And as you see here, and I'll let you take it over from there, comprehension is because of 2 main parts.
Right. So the vocabulary that we just finished discussing, just highlighting where we might develop the vocabulary, added together with the domain knowledge that was mentioned just a moment ago, coming from E.D. Hirsch, out of his book, Cultural Literacy. And I didn't really explain a whole lot of what it was then, so we'll do that now. The idea of domain knowledge is that you have some different topics, if you will, or areas of life, a domain that you have knowledge of or that you don't. So if I'm reading something in a domain that I have no knowledge of, I'm going to struggle to comprehend it, even if I do understand every word that's on the page. For example, if I were reading something about nanotechnology, I am not going to understand very much of that. But if we are discussing, or if I'm reading something in the field of education, I probably will have a pretty good understanding, because that's a domain I'm very familiar with, which is why we want to expose our children to as many domains or topics as we can to help them to grow, because those two together, again, vocabulary plus domain knowledge, is what will give them the very best comprehension of what it is that they're reading. Cindy mentioned how much she enjoys the language development visuals that we have in our materials for the 2s and the 3s, and we use it up with the 4s as well. And there's an example here on your screen of the dogs. So we're in the D instructional time.
We're in the D domain.
We're in the D domain, yes. But this helps us to have an opportunity to talk about the different dogs, what they do, how God made them with unique characteristics. And inside the teacher material, the one that's at the bottom there, just a little tiny picture of the teacher's material that ties in with those visuals. It gives you all kinds of information to share about the different kinds of dogs. And then you'll build their domain knowledge in that area. That particular set has 76 different topics that we're talking about exposing 2s, 3s, and 4-year-olds to help them to grow in that area. They'll also, in that same week, learn about donkeys and doctors and dentists, again, all in the D domain, which will help them to be prepared. It'll help them to be prepared to go visit the dentist and not be scared of doing so, because they've learned more about it. Here's from that teacher material.
Giving them something to sink their teeth into.
Oh, dear.
All right, moving on.
So this information, this is what the teacher would have to tie in with that same visual. When the teacher is teaching about dogs, the students then get to talk about it. There are suggestions for class activities that they might be doing, like having a stuffed animal that they can pretend to bathe. So practicing like you would give a dog a bath. And then the teacher will teach more about dogs, and there's room for more discussion. They're entitled Looking and Thinking in different portions. There are some poems tied into that, some different games that they might play, some stories. But you'll notice that overall, these are factual things that the teacher is telling the children. It's not just an entertaining story.
I love the phrase content rich, information rich. I know sometimes I use that when I'm talking about our science books, which is another domain that we seek to introduce our students to through the years. But we're not just encouraging them to focus on their own emotions or focus on what they already know, but we are broadening their horizons, sometimes with things they may not initially be interested in, but again, giving them that domain knowledge to it.
The second example I have comes from the Animal Alphabet Friends. This is another preschool to K4 resource, which allows the teacher to bring them through other topical studies. Again, domain knowledge expansion. You see this is a bit heavy toward the pre-K and kindergarten, which is purposeful, because the more we can give them that solid foundation earlier, the better their comprehension will be earlier. So that intentionality behind that. This particular one for Betsy B, it takes them into the world of honeybees, particularly. And again, it's factual, content-rich material that has so many activities and different ideas for the teacher to do with the children. A song, of course, to be able to help them to retain that. So again, that was looking specifically at what we would do in the lower elementary, but of course we're continuing to develop that as they go through their other readers and other, well, when we get into the content subjects, science and history and health, there's so much room to expand their domain knowledge and their comprehension as we continue to grow. I have an example of Aesop's Fable here, which is helping the children first, again, with words to watch for as we expand their vocabulary. And then we have opportunities for the students to participate so that, and it's reminding them to call on the individuals to read and have the students work on enunciation and speed. So some of the reminders we talked about with fluency. Some students may need to slow down in order to be clearly understood as they read through these bigger stories that they're expanding in first grade. This is the 6th reader in the series there for them. Comprehension questions are there to provoke them to pay attention and to understand what they are learning. We mentioned before that when they're marked with an asterisk, it's going to be a thinking question, definitely challenging their comprehension as they are reading through. And you also notice that there is a Bible verse at the bottom there about pride goeth before destruction. If you know anything about Aesop's fables, you know that they have a moral to every one of the stories. And it's most important that we not just have it be a moral that's got no connection, no foundation, but that we bring it right back to the biblical principle that is being illustrated there.
And what you have here, because the student may have the vocab and he may have the domain knowledge, but the reason we've just shown several pages from one of our readers in first grade is he may often not be putting it together and thinking. Mm-hmm. So comprehension may not be there due to lack of effort, lack of skilled putting of the effort. But that's why, as you all know, it's those questions that are challenging and pushing the child to think that can also really build that comprehension.
We also have what we would call more obvious reading comprehension practice starting in 2nd grade with these skill sheets that we practice with the students. This one's a 3rd grade example. These have a short reading selection for the students on a number of different topics and genres. Mm-hmm. So they're getting the challenge of reading and understanding different kinds of content. So they read a little portion and then there are questions for them to answer. In this particular one, I like to highlight the question the question that I highlighted is asking them to circle the word of the 4 choices that shows how the words that describe how the people felt about the missionaries. And in order to be able to do that effectively, the children need to learn how to locate this information. And the suggestion is on the bottom of the worksheet that the children take out a blue crayon and underline the details in the story that show how the Chinese people felt about the missionaries. So if we kind of zoom in on the reading selection, I am going to underline some of those words for you in blue. One phrase or saying comes that the people said, we must get rid of these foreign devils. That definitely implies a very negative feeling. Another place it says people jeered at them, threatened them, and stole their few possessions. So from those parts of the story, the child can understand that they did not feel kindly about the missionaries at that point. They were blaming them for the drought that had hit the land and was causing the crops to fail.
And that may even be profitable. Again, this is a 3rd grade example that you're using, but certainly those on the secondary level, you may find students with very low comprehension. Well, we have some built-in strategies and tools in our 7th, 8th, and 9th grade books. This is something else that you can have when you're working one-on-one with that student. Have them go back and specifically mark some of these details. The more they do that purposefully, the more they'll be able to do it automatically later on and develop their reading.
Which really brings us to the conclusion of the comparison between our Abeka program and the science of reading, the body of knowledge. Again, knowing that it's not a specific program of study, it can be really challenging to talk about it and not have it sound like it's this one specific program. Correct. But I hope that what we've covered together has been helpful to answer some questions, but we realize it may not answer all of them.
Yes. And for that reason, if that is the case, despite our using this as a longer session, 4 parts, we still feel as if we've only scratched the surface, both of the Abeka Reading Program as well as the Science of Reading. So some of you may have more questions, more specific questions. Reach out to your reps. We've already been in contact with some of our Abeka field representatives who have gotten us connected with schools. We've had some conversations with teachers. with curriculum developers who are specifically wanting more information on this topic. So if these 4 parts have only whetted your appetite for more, reach out to your Abeka representative who will get you in contact with us, and we would enjoy the opportunity to talk with you more specifically, more individually, one-on-one. But to all of you, I appreciate the time you have invested in listening to these. Hopefully you've also had a chance to look at them too, because of the illustrations and examples that we've used to emphasize and clarify. But I wish you Godspeed in your school year as it comes quickly to an end, and may the Lord continue to bless you in your ministry.